Hi, I'm Brian Burns, and I make classical and flamenco guitars here in Fort Bragg, California, on California's beautiful north coast, and I teach guitar making as well. And I'd like to demonstrate a sharpening system that I developed back in the 1970s. Um, and I've actually, for those of you who are old timers, and who have a certain prejudice against using a honing guide, let me tell you that I too am an old timer. I started making my first guitars in 1962, and when it became obvious that I needed to do other things to make money, for the next 10 years, I did all kinds of other things, including working in cabinet shops and making furniture and that type of thing. And then along in and all this time, I was doing the sharpening of my tools by the standard hand-holding method, using Arkansas stones and carborundum stones that were available at the time. And then I discovered in the late 70s Japanese water stones, and in particular the Japanese polishing stone. This happens to be a Takanoko 8,000 grit stone, which I like very much. The problem with hand holding with the Japanese water stones, particularly with the polishing stone, is that if you get the angle of your tool up a tiny bit too high, you will carve a divot right out of the stone because it's quite soft. They have to be soft because the surface needs to wear away regularly to expose new sharp particles. So these stones, the polishing stone, I've been using this one for about 10 years. I probably got another 5 years of use out of it. It'll go on, and it stays aggressive. It doesn't dull over like the hard stones do. So I had to figure out how to use that polishing stone. I was getting the sharpest edges I'd ever gotten, beautifully polished edges. But I had to figure out a way to hold the tool while I was doing the sharpening. So I looked around at the honing guides that were available at the time, and there were 4 or 5 different ones. And I settled on the General, which has got a leg that comes over and can sit on a stack of shims. And we used this for 8 or 10 years, I guess. And then a couple of friends of mine, Todd Taggart, who's now of Allied Luthier, and Fred Damson of the Japan Woodworker, talked me into writing a booklet on my sharpening system. So I did the first edition of that. And shortly after the first edition came out, General stopped making this tool. And I thought, well, maybe I could come up with an improvement on it. So eventually I developed this tool here, which will accommodate a wider range of sizes of tool, and also oddball tools like cranked paring chisels. That's what this slot is for here. And there's a little tilt here so that you can sharpen a skew chisel by tilting it off to the side a bit. And it'll accommodate everything from tiny little chisels to the huge timber framing slicks, the chisels that are 2.5, 3 inches wide. So none of this will make any sense until you actually see what it can do and the quality of the kinds of finishes you get just with a hand plane, and also how easily you can work with a chisel. Okay, we're going to sharpen a standard woodworking chisel, and pretty much the entire range of angles that you might want to sharpen a chisel at are 25 to 40 degrees, and 30 degrees is a good general purpose angle. So we'll go ahead and sharpen this guy at 30 degrees, and you'll see what's involved in the process. So the very first thing we do is we put the chisel in the honing guide, and we make the forward portion of the chisel, the amount that projects, 1.25 inches. So what we do to begin with is we make 1.25 inches of the chisel stick out in front of the honing guide. And we use this little gauge here that I've made out of 1/4 inch plywood. Shows 1.25 inches here, 2.5 for plain irons, and then for another kind of plain iron we got 4 inches on the back. And instructions for making this are all in the double bevel sharpening booklet. So we're at 1.25 inches, and we're going to start out with the 45 micron stone, and we're going to check our bevel angle here, which should be 30 degrees, because I've chosen these shims to bring the honing guide up to produce a 30-degree angle with 1.25 inch projection. All right. So what you can do, actually, let's do a little different thing here. Let's go with a magic marker, actually marks a lot, across the bevel, just so that we can tell where we are actually doing our sharpening. Now, you don't have to do that every time, but it's helpful to, when you're first getting started, to know just where you're set for. So we go back and forth a few strokes like so, and we have a look and see where our black marker disappeared, and it's well back up here. So we need to go a little bit steeper, and I'm going to just add a little tiny shim, 1/8 inch thick shim, to take us up a little bit to a little higher angle. The last time we sharpened this, we probably sharpened a little bit high. Okay, let's see how we're doing here. It's looking pretty nearly the way we want it. Let's go just a little bit more on this one, and then we'll switch to the polishing stone. So I'm jumping all the way from 325 grit to 8,000 grit. And I used to swap in the 9 micron stone here, which is a rather finer grit. It's about 1,200 grit. And do an intermediate step. But my friend, the furniture maker Loy Martin down in Palo Alto, says that he finds that the polishing stone is so aggressive that he can just skip that step altogether. And if there's one thing I believe in doing production work or trying to do things quickly, it's not just to make steps faster, but eliminate them altogether. So here we are on the polishing stone, and I'm going to draw back for 6 strokes because the polishing stone is set ever so much lower than the coarse stone. So this is about a 1/64 of an inch thick. So what this does is allow the chisel to tilt down ever so slightly, and we know for sure that we're actually working right at the cutting edge. So instead of being 30 degrees, we're probably 30.25 or something. I've never actually figured it out. So now, be sure, because this stone is so soft, that you draw back, 4 or 5, maybe 6 strokes. And that produces a little flat right at the cutting edge, so that when you go forward, you don't carve a hunk out of the stone. Now, I don't know if you can see in the picture all this black stuff that's occurring here, but that's steel. This stone never gets dull because fresh. Once again, we've got a real shiny area over here on the right side. Bigger, we've reversed the left side. And we need to tilt that right side a little farther forward again. Might have moved it a tiny bit. Let me torque down on these some more. I can actually feel the drag of the steel on the stone. And we've accumulated quite a fair amount of steel up here. And the great thing about this polishing stone, and this happens to be a Takenoko brand polishing stone, which you get from Japan Woodworker. The great thing about this is when you get done with one face, there's no burr. Or if there is a burr, I can't find it with a 200 power microscope, and I have looked. Okay, let's see how we're doing. See if we got any burr left here. And the easiest way to detect burr is to try picking at it with your fingernail like that. If your fingernail hesitates, and it does a little bit, then you're not quite done. So I'm wiping the accumulated steel particles off the polishing stone, and using my high-tech squirt bottle here, which has got water with a little detergent in it, I go back to it here. Now, I'm just looking to get rid of the burr on the backside. And like I say again, you can really get pretty aggressive with this system, and that's where the speed is. Okay, that probably, ooh, yeah. Yeah, okay, that gives us our nice polished edge. So this is polished to an 8,000 grit polish, which is absolutely mirror polish, and which makes getting a really world-class edge quick and easy. One of the most important things to realize is that an edge is only as sharp as the two planes that coincide to form that edge. So you can't ignore the back face. And it turns out that there's this perverse aspect of chisels, which is that they always seem to have a big bulge right here. So if you try to lay the chisel down on the surface of the stone and rub it back and forth and polish it, it'll polish this big bulge rather than the area right adjacent to the cutting edge, which is where you really want to do your polishing. So what I do, and this is part of the reason that that the stones are elevated this high, what I do is I put the chisel in upside down all the way as far as it'll go, like so. And this is something you do once every 5 or so times that you sharpen. You don't have to do it every time because we've already gotten rid of the burr. So I go up to here to where we're at 0 with shims, and see how many shims we need. Oh, that's a little too much. So you can use most any kind of material for shims provided it's flat. It's reasonably flat. Now, that's a little too high too. So we go back to our little 1/8 inch masonite shims here and creep up on it. That ought to get us to about where, yeah, now we're right there. So what I'm doing here is I'm just working the front edge of the stone like so. Now, one of the great things about this stone is it does not leave a burr on either face. If there is a burr there, I can't find it with a 200 power microscope, and I have really looked to try to find it. All right, so there we are with the back face of our chisel polished right to a mirror polish right where we need it, right near the cutting edge. And I'll turn this back and forth so you can kind of see that polish. And that, my friends, is a sharp chisel. It is so sharp that it'll do what you saw earlier. And at about that length of time, well, actually a little faster because I wouldn't be talking. Okay, now we're going to sharpen a plane iron. And we do the same thing that we did with the chisel, which is to make 1 1/4 inches of the iron project out the front. And this particular plane iron and this particular plane are going to be set up to plane figured woods, or woods where you have to go against the grain. Often so-called straight grain hardwoods will have several grain direction changes right on the length of one board without any figure to speak of, but you'll have to go against the grain. So I'm going to go to a 40-degree angle, and this will be the top bevel angle on this Veritas plane, which is the standard Veritas block plane. It's got a 20-degree bed angle built into it. So we're going to add 40 degrees to that. We're actually going to have a cutting angle of 60 degrees. All of this angle stuff is covered in the book, all of the explanations for it, and here on the inside back cover are suggested angles for different hardnesses of woods and whether you're going to go against the grain and whether you're going to be using a bench plane or a block plane. But since we got time constraints here, I'm just going to sharpen the iron for the high angle use on figured woods and for the 20-degree block plane. There's something seductive about the idea of a low angle block plane. I don't suggest you get one. They're harder to sharpen. Okay. And this, by the way, is one of my favorite planes in the world. I've owned probably 25 planes and made another 25 myself, and I really love this little plane. Okay, so here we are, and we're going to check for 40 degrees. And sure enough, it's 40 degrees. And I've used just about all my shims here to make this stack here. And you can begin to see why, with the extremely low angles and extremely high angles, that I have the stone box with the stones projected up above the bench. I'm going to put some marks on here with the Marks-A-Lot. I like that brand of marker. It's pretty much waterproof, so you don't have to worry about washing it off. And this will tell us where on the bevel we're doing our sharpening. And if our angle's a little off, we can make some adjustments. But we'd like it to be right down at the cutting edge. Variations of maybe 5 degrees in the sharpening angle really make a significant difference. But 2 or 3 degrees, 1 or 2 degrees doesn't matter much. So, yep, we're right at the cutting edge. Right down here, I can just see a little shiny line. If I went back and forth a few times, like so. Now we've got a tiny little bevel here at 40 degrees, and it's a little bit stronger on the right-hand side. Now I happen to be right-handed, and I press a little harder with my right hand, so I'm going to correct that just by pressing a little harder with my left hand. Okay, now our bevel is pretty much straight across. Now I've gone to a much steeper bevel on this particular iron. It was sharpened at a lower angle. So that's all I need to do, that much. So now we can switch to the polishing stone, and the back side of the polishing stone, the other side of the polishing stone, if I flip it lengthwise, is slightly curved this way. So I keep a little bit of a hollow built into the stone so that the plane iron actually is sharpened with a very slight curvature around the front of the cutting edge. And that has a number of advantages, not the least of which is you can plane a wide piece of material and leave very shallow scallops. The shavings actually feather off to nothing on the edges. You don't make a bunch of channels on a tabletop or something like that. So here we go with our slightly curved stone, and to put the curve in there to begin with, I use a special sanding block that's got some wet or dry sandpaper around it, and there are instructions in the booklet for how to make that block. So here we are at our 40-degree angle, and once again we're going to pull back like so, and you can see we got stripes on either corner of black where it's taking the steel off. And what that does is to gradually form the leading edge into a curved shape. That also helps in making joints, by the way. All the stress on a joint is at the outer edges, and if you make the joint slightly hollow, it's actually a lot more resistant to coming apart. Okay, let's see if I've gotten rid of my burr here. Yep, it's gone. And I don't know if you can see, but I'll tilt this back and forth. The polish you get is absolutely mirror polish. And that translates into an extremely sharp blade. The other thing about it is that it's quick. You can get to that high level of sharpness very quickly. So now I'm going to turn the plane iron over, and we're going to put an 8-degree bevel on the bottom side. And again, this is all the reason for these angles is all explained in the book. And in order to get enough travel, we're going to make the extension here be 2.5 inches. So 2.5, like that. Tighten it down. And in this case, we need to set up our 8 degrees. And I have a mark here on the front of the stone box that shows me 8 degrees. But I always like to check it with the angle indicator just to make sure that that I'm about where I want to be here. Okay, let's go with our 1/2-inch plywood here. That looks like right on the money. So let's check and see if we've got an 8-degree bevel here. And notice I'm just going to be using, that says we got more like 10. So we want to get rid of about 1/4 of an inch. 1/8 of an inch is about 1 degree variation. And we can dial it in as accurately as we care about, but 8 degrees is just nice. And that looks like we're getting 8 degrees right there. Okay, so wipe the stone down, get rid of some of that steel. And once again, notice I'm not bothering to go to the 45 micron stone. Just pull it back 4 or 5 times. If you go forward, you'll remember not to the next time, because you'll, on your very first stroke you go forward, you'll carve a hunk right out of the stone. But whoever developed these stones was a genius, because they realized that in order for it to stay aggressive and actually do the work, it needed to wear away. And you have to maintain the stones. You can flatten them with a piece of sandpaper on a piece of glass. That's good enough. So what we're making here is what I call a double bevel. This is what I call a double bevel sharpening system. You're making a secondary bevel on the bottom side, and it's being polished to a 8,000 grit level, which means that the intersection of those 2 bevels is polished. Both faces of that bevel, or that cutting edge, are polished to 8,000 grit. And that's how you manage to get the kinds of results that I get. And you get a lot of service out of one of these Takanoko stones. I've had this one for pretty nearly 10 years now, I think, and it's still probably got 5 or 10 more years in it. So there we have a plane iron sharpened for the block plane. 40-degree bevel on the top side, 8-degree bevel on the bottom side. The 2 planes are intersecting, both polished to 8,000 grit. And of course, for a bench plane, one of these guys, you got a whole different set of angles. But all of that stuff is covered in the book, so you can just look at the inside back cover, and it'll tell you just what angles to set up the honing guide for to get the cutting angles that you want with a bench plane. This is the what to get and where to get it portion of the video. First of all, I would recommend getting my booklet, Double Bevel Sharpening. I've published this now for somewhere over a dozen years, and we're up to the version 3.3. So it's been revised in large ways and small ways over the years. It has all of the practical and theoretical stuff you need to know about sharpening with 2 bevels. And if you'd like to get the honing guide, which I like a lot myself, I sell it as a kit. It comes with the angle indicator and a copy of the booklet. These are available, both these are available either together or separately, direct from me, or from Luthier's Mercantile International, which is in Windsor, California. It's a guitar maker supplies primarily, or from the Japan Woodworker in Alameda. And then I also have made by a local craftsman, wonderful craftsman by the name of Dale Simpson, the stone box. And of course the instructions for making the stone box and for making your own honing guide are in the booklet. But if you'd like to, if your time is more important, you can get the stone box with its adjustable mounts for the stones, and these set of 7 3/4-inch MDF shims and 7 masonite shims, also either direct from me or from Luthier's Mercantile or from the Japan Woodworker. As for stones, the stone that I really couldn't do without is the 45 micron, which is called coarse by DMT. DMT is diamond machining technology, and this is their Dia-Sharp line of stones. And they are sold at deep discounts, so if you sharp around on the web, and there are a bunch of places that carry them. If you would want to get either of these others, I recommend them as well. This is the 120 micron stone, which is very coarse, and it's for removing big nicks, or if you want to go from a steep angle on your chisel or your plane iron down to a lower angle, you can hog off steel pretty fast with that. And this is a 9 micron, which is the equivalent of 1200 grit, which is really quite fine. And it does a really nice job on scrapers. So, and I also sometimes will use it as an intermediate stone before I go to the polishing stone, after having used the 45 micron stone. The one that I really can't do without is the Takenoko 8000 grit polishing stone. You'd have a hard time wearing out one of these in a lifetime. I've used this one, at least 10 years. It started out about 3/4 of an inch thick, and we're down to about half now. But I use it a lot. My students use it a lot, and it is really the key to really quickly putting a wonderful world-class edge on any of your chisels, plane irons, that type of thing. So that's it, and thanks very much for watching.